Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about structuration theory, and there are two key figures in this area. There's Pierre Bourdieu, who you would have come across before, and they're both contemporaries. So Pierre Bourdieu was French born and he lived from 1930 to 2002, and Anthony Giddens was English born. I think he is still alive, I should check on that. And they're contemporary, they're kind of the key contemporary theorists in this field, but I'm going to introduce you to Margaret Archer as well towards the end. From the 1970s, they both put forward different versions of structuration. They have in common an emphasis on social practices or daily activities that are routinized, which just means making something into a routine or a habit. It becomes commonplace and therefore it feels natural and normal. For both of them, structure and society aren't things outside of individuals. Structure and society are actually social practices that are engaged in daily. Despite the attempts of both to avoid the streams of objectivist and subjectivist, critics argue that Bourdieu places an emphasis on structure and Giddens on agency, and that's what the Sewell article is all about. Not completely new, of course. I'm going to read here, for those who aren't viewing this, a quotation from Marx. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, and just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honoured disguise and borrowed language. End of quote, Marx, 1852. So, you, I'm sure, have come across Anthony Giddens. He grew up in London, grew up in a lower middle class family, was the son of a clerk with London Transport and was first in his family at university. He drew on Garfinkel, and I've mentioned Garfinkel a couple of times. He's the breaching experiment person. I know he's only been a passing mention. If you do have time and inclination, I'd recommend a read of his book, Studies in Ethnomethodology. He created the term ethnomethodology as a way to describe how people use different methods in order to understand, I guess, the society they live in. Giddens also drew on the ideas of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was an Austrian-British philosopher, and he worked in several areas of philosophy, including the philosophy of language. Giddens wanted to understand interactions, hence his interest in the work of Garfinkel and Wittgenstein. He trained as a sociologist and social theorist. He lectured at universities in Europe, North America and Australia before co-founding an academic publishing house, Polity Press, in 1985. In 1997, he became director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, a position he held until 2003. He was later, when he retired, Professor Emeritus. He was a very influential advisor to British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he had a concept of a third way, a political program not limited by the traditional sort of left-right political dichotomy. And that third way was seen as underpinning Blair's Labor government. In 2004, Giddens became a member of the House of Lords and received a life peerage as Baron Giddens of Southgate in the London Borough of Enfield. He's written numerous books and is somewhat of a contentious figure because of his ideas, probably seen as a little bit too right-wing for many. Giddens' theory of structuration explores the question of whether it is individual or social forces that shape our social reality. He eschews extreme positions, arguing that although people are not entirely free to choose their own actions, and their knowledge is limited, they nonetheless are the agency which reproduces the social structure and leads to reproduction or social change. So structuration theory seeks to avoid the extremes of objectivist out there and subjectivist in here, and explain how social order is reproduced over time and space. So that's called social reproduction, and how the social order is changed, or social transformation. For him, they don't privilege, he doesn't privilege one over the other. He sees this actually as a dualism. Instead, he argues that structure, or social organisation, and agency, the individual's ability to act, should be thought of as a duality. Structure plus action equals structuration. He rejected functionalism, structuralism, and orthodox Marxism because of their unacceptable downgrading of human agency. He ended up deciding that Marxism was too economically reductionist, and he ended up using capitalism as just one of four key institutions, along with surveillance, military power, and industrialization. He was also very critical of microsociologists like Goffman, even though he drew on Goffman, but he didn't want to stay at the level of the individual. He wanted to see how the individual in turn helps to shape social structures. Giddens thinks that agents, and when he's talking about an agent, he's talking about what we might think of as an individual person, thinks that agents have knowledge. Without knowledge, social life would be impossible, would all be ontologically insecure. So he's saying what we know what it is that we need to do in social life, and ontological security is the drive for security that leads to reproduction, social reproduction, rather than transformation. So what Giddens did was draw on the work of psychoanalysts, including the maverick R.D. Laing, who coined the term. He drew on this idea of ontological security, which refers to a fundamental sense of confidence that most humans have in the continuity of themselves and the constancy of their surroundings. And that, of course, is going to be, like most things in human society, on a spectrum where some people will be more ontologically secure than others, depending on what's happened for them in their life. So he believed people make society in every social encounter. So society is simply what we do. It's in our practices all the time. Human agency, he said, is bounded. It's bounded by the unconscious. We don't always know the reasons why we act. It's bounded by the resources and materials we've inherited from the past, by unintended consequences as well. So society is what we do, but however, he concedes that there are boundaries as well. So an example of social practice is the preparation of food, which kind of requires three elements: understanding about what to eat, when to eat, what's appropriate at what time, breakfast foods, for example, which differ from culture to culture, and where to eat, whether we eat at the dining room table or a couch. Then there's the material elements, the food, the shopping, the kitchen appliances and all of that. And then there's the knowledge and skills to source and prepare and cook the food as well. So agents, Giddens believes, are skilled performers of social practices, which are mostly carried out at a level of practical consciousness. So not really thought through, just got on, and you just get on and do it and forget that you've learned it. That's what's meant by practical consciousness. However, some agents reflect on practices. Think about reflecting on a practice when you go to a new culture, for example. You might suddenly find out that not everybody has toast and a cup of tea for breakfast. So you'll reflect on the practices, and then that you can operate at the level of discursive consciousness, where you're able to put into words what you've been doing and the differences between what you've been doing and somebody in a different culture. So the social rules of having a conversation usually are at the level of practical consciousness once we've learned them, and until somebody comes along and breaks them or talks to us about them, as Goffman did. Often if somebody breaks the rules, we call them rude. And of course Garfinkel comes to mind again as where Goffman wanted to study what was going on. Garfinkel actually wanted students to deliberately break rules in order to reflect on them. So practical consciousness means that we actually know but don't necessarily express. For example, you know how to tie shoelaces, but can you tell someone else how to do it? I know how to drive a car, but if I was to teach someone, I'd have to first think about all the steps involved and how I was going to explain that. So I'd need to take something that I do at a practical consciousness level and bring that up to discursive consciousness. And that's the same with all our activities in the social world. We know what to do. We can't always explain why or how we do it, which always reminds me of 2-year-olds, because they do ask why, they do want to know why. According to Giddens, agents are engaged in social practices and they draw on 2 types of resources. Authoritative, being able to get others to do things. For example, a mother getting a child to clean their teeth. So you have influence, authority over others, and allocative. So using objects, for example, using a car rather than walking to do the shopping. So according to Giddens, structures are simply made up of rules, which are held in practical consciousness, and resources. And the resources agents can draw on for those practices. So structure creates practices, and practices create structure. And an agent's capacity to carry out their practices is very much influenced by what resources they have at their disposal and how skilled they are at using them. When it comes to social reproduction, he says that institutions are stable over time, for example, marriage and university, although marriage has been around a lot longer than university, because social practices have become routinized and carried out repeatedly, so that is, they persist over time and space. But if most agents stopped carrying out these practices, the institution would disappear. So take marriage, for example. It doesn't look as if it's disappearing anytime soon, but it has certainly declined very markedly since the 1970s, when there were 9.3 marriages per 1,000 Australian residents. So that makes a marriage rate of 9.3. In 2016, the marriage rate had declined to 4.9. When it comes to social transformation, agents stop various practices, and this changes everything. For example, foot binding, compelling unmarried women to give up their babies for adoption. And that practice of compelling unmarried women to give up their babies for adoption has led to a decline of 57% in the number of adoptions over the past 25 years. So things do change. Structures, he said, are simply made up of rules that are in practical consciousness and resources agents can draw on for those practices. So to repeat, structure creates practices and practices create structure. He suggests that structures, so think about their traditions, institutions, moral codes, other sets of expectations, patterns, established ways of doing things, are generally quite stable but can be changed, especially sometimes through unintended consequences, but also when people decide deliberately to ignore them, to replace them, or to do them differently. Okay, so I'll move on from there, I think. All right, so I'm going to move on to Bourdieu, and his work you would know about already. It comes up a lot when we talk about class, taste and culture, and there are a number of studies which emulate his work in different contexts, particularly in Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. He was an outsider, came from a modest family, went to boarding school. He also was first in his family at university. His book Distinction was radical and really, really popular. It is an ethnography of 1960s and 1970s France. He explores culture, class, lifestyle, and everyday life, and he did that by actually administering surveys, doing participant observation. So he had empirical evidence to test his theory. I always think it's a good idea to think about these ideas in the context of your own life, whether they're applicable to now, to Australia. And I guess one of the major criticisms is the lack of attention paid to gender, ethnicity and youth in this book. He does do that in other places, but not in this book. What else can I say about Bourdieu? You probably know almost everything. He did feel like an outsider, but he came to be known, really, as one of the most important theorists of his time. and he's got this idea of distinction, how you can have a distinction as being a game. It's a metaphor of a game. It's not a metaphor I'm particularly fond of, but I'll continue using that in this case because that's his. And he reckons that the winners keep on tending to win and the losers keep on tending to lose. So his definition of culture includes the fields of art, music and literature, television and food. And he says that it acts as a social agent, that it actually does have political implications. So in exposing the political dimensions of culture, Bourdieu rejects claims that culture is timeless and universal. He also rejects the idea that culture operates outside of class. What he says is that what is considered legitimate culture is closely associated with entitlement and social privilege, and that our private leisure can actually reveal important information, what we do at home in our own time, about the political dimensions of culture, and can also reveal quite important insights about social inequality as well. So he says that privilege and class are reproduced through habitus, habitus being the environment in which we're socialised, as well as institutions such as schools, art galleries, museums, etc. Three main principles: cultural capital, which is much like property according to Bourdieu, those with it gain access to it at the expense of those who don't, and there is a process of accumulation and circulation, and middle classes are physically and intellectually socialised into appreciating legitimate culture. The culture is then institutionalised by schools and other institutions like art galleries, but it's different from property in that it's not separate from us, it's actually embodied by us and is bound up with our perceptions and dispositions. So we cannot assess it objectively because we're all implicated in it in one way or another. His other two important concepts are the idea of fields, so fields of culture. Different fields make up culture, for example, so he'll have art and journalism, university, and then the idea of reproduction, social reproduction. So what Bourdieu found was that those in French society schooled in legitimate culture had certain privileges that others didn't, and that's what he called cultural capital. And he saw a divide between high and mass or popular culture, and that those who were versed in high culture were seen to have much more capital than those who weren't. When it comes to fields, his examples include literature, the visual arts, journalism, music. So he says that each cultural field has its own autonomy and can be recognised as a distinct field, and can be understood by reference to the dynamics within it. However, there are similar principles that can be found across different fields, and in general, fields involve the polarisation of those who are considered to be part of the field and those who are not. I wanted to mention this idea of knowledge, doxa, and by doxa he means naturalised knowledge, that is accepted as true without critique. So if you think about the idea of the flat earth, that now has been challenged, but for a very long period of time that was doxa. Doxa makes the social world appear as natural with no need of interpretation. And I'm thinking there of an example of women are inferior, so there was no need to do anything with that except accept it for generations until eventually it was challenged. But until it was challenged, it was just seen as, it was doxa, it was just seen as naturalised knowledge. There are lots of other examples depending on the field that you're in and your interests. When it comes to things like the best interests of the child, that's usually doxa, and it's not necessarily critiqued. What does that actually mean? Different fields, he says, will have their own doxa. So a medical doctor draws on the doxa of the biomedical field, which is fair enough, whereas a sociologist draws on sociological theories, and we're still all looking at illness, but we'll be looking at it through the doxa of those two different fields. Reproduction, according to Bourdieu, ways of being are inherited via our family's habitus, which includes not just our family grouping, but the school that we've gone to, the immediate environment as well. Think about the difference between growing up in a small country town and growing up in large city, or think about the difference between going to a state school and an elite private school. So that's all part of the reproduction. We then reproduce this habitus through our own behaviour and embodied experience, and then it's also passed down, of course, through formal education. The winners, as I said at the start, for Bourdieu, keep tending to win, and the losers keep tending to lose, and that's that metaphor of social relations as a game. So some people are born into a family that knows the game and others are not, and that's why you end up with winners and losers. So in those fields, which are also, you could think of as social structure or social differentiation, the games are played within and between each field, and most game playing is at the level of practical consciousness, although you will have had to have learnt it at some point. And habitus, or our subjectivity, informs our trajectory. So those with an upper class heritage are already advantaged. That is, they will already have embodied high cultural capital ways of being, for example, so speaking in the right way. And in most fields, what he says is that those at the top come from an upper class habitus and those at the bottom from a lower class habitus. So, taste is socially conditioned, is what he's saying. Our taste, our consumption choices do not arise from innate or individual preferences. Rather, our taste is socially conditioned, and the objects of our taste carry symbolic meaning and then operate to maintain the status quo and the privilege of the socially dominant. So the crux of the matter is that those who possess large amounts of economic or cultural capital, or both, are dominant and seek to impose their tastes on those who are less dominant. Then we also have this idea of symbolic capital. You would already know about social, economic and cultural capital. But Bourdieu says that it is symbolic capital that converts cultural capital into power. And for those who are listening and not viewing this, I'm going to read a quote from Beverly Skeggs, who's a UK academic. And she says, symbolic capital is the form the different types of capital take once they are perceived and recognised as legitimate. So legitimation is the key mechanism in the conversion to power. Cultural capital has to be legitimised to be capitalised upon. And I've used the photo of Rosie Batty's picture here, as she had considerable symbolic capital after being awarded the highly prestigious Australian of the Year in 2015, and she's been a campaigner against domestic violence, as you probably know, since her son Luke was murdered by his father. So how things tend to work is that the professions will have, people who work in the professions will have high economic capital and high cultural capital. Those who work in industry and commerce will have high economic capital but low cultural capital. Those who work as teachers will have low economic capital but high cultural capital, and those who work in factories will have low economic and cultural capital. So taste, he says, functions as a marker of class. So our taste in food, art, everything reflects habitus, which is our conditioning, our socialisation. It's not innate, it is acquired. There is a hierarchy, of course, of arts and genres, and the value depends on the social mark attached to them. That is the prestige, which does tend to change over time. And the profit, how we profit on that, depends on our competence. And the paradox, he says, is that it's impossible to know if the distinguished is so because it is dominant, or because it is dominant, it appears to have the desired qualities. And just another quotation from Bourdieu this time. Objectively and subjectively, aesthetic stances adopted in cosmetics, clothing, home decoration, or opportunities to assert one's position in social space as a rank to be upheld or distance to be kept. And that was Bourdieu in 1984. So dominant groups tend to favour invisible acquisition. They're brought up in it, so it feels completely natural. There's a learning of culture at home, going to concerts, reading the classics daily, and manners are instilled from birth, and antiques tend to be handed down for generations. Experts, however, can act as intermediaries between the classes. Advertising, think about some of the reality television shows. I always think about the charm schools for working class girls where they were taught how to be ladies. So for Bourdieu, this means there's a symbolic integration of the dominant classes, or of the dominated classes, by imposed needs. So you need to watch your weight. There'll be magazines for the well-heeled executive. So rather than inculcating norms from birth, we'll learn how we're supposed to be, because the dominating classes will impose their values. In terms of acquisition, if we think about the professions, generally art is handed down where there's high cultural capital and high economic capital, whereas if you're in the if you can afford to buy art, then you'll buy it. It might not have been handed down. You might be the first person in your family who's very wealthy. For those who don't have a lot of money but have high cultural capital, they'll visit art galleries. For those who can't afford art and don't have high cultural capital, they will wear tattoos and buy prints, and that of course is all contested, and the value of tattoos at the present time has certainly increased in terms of cultural capital than it had, say, 20 years ago. When it comes to form versus function, people who are from good material conditions tend not to require things from necessity. So there's these oppositions between the tastes of freedom or the tastes of necessity. And the taste of necessity is where we have to make forced choices, really, because the conditions of existence rules out alternatives, although of course we can imagine them. So people who come from material conditions that are removed from necessity, the priority is given to style, to form, so to the shape of the body, the social form. Even clothes, for example, it can be focused on fashion and aesthetics. Food doesn't really need to be filling, whereas if you don't have a lot of money, then food does need to be filling, and it needs to be cheap. There tends to be less focus on form when you're talking about things. It's more like telling it as it is, not standing on ceremony. And clothes, of course, need to last. There have been criticisms of Bourdieu's work, and I would ask the question if life is a little bit messier now as well. The main criticism is that the idea of cultural reproduction seems too overly deterministic and doesn't account for upward mobility. Some people say that the cultural divisions are less marked in Australia than they were in France. There have been changes over time. The distinctions between high and low brow are too simplistic, and again, they might change over time. Another one is that neoliberalism means that consumption has become quite diversified and fragmented now, and the internet and other technological advances challenge Bourdieu's concept of a distinct field, which is an interesting thing to think about as well. Herbert Gaines is a German-born American sociologist, and he proposes that popular culture consists of different taste cultures, and that it developed as an alternative to mass cultural theory, which viewed pop culture as commercial and inferior to high culture. And he argues that popular culture appeals to certain audiences with different backgrounds. Therefore, pop culture should be seen as a legitimate taste culture that serves a specific purpose. The omnivore thesis was first introduced by Richard Peterson back in 1992, and he was an American sociologist at Vanderbilt University. And by cultural I can't even say that. The omnivore thesis, he's referring to a particular cultural appreciation profile, and according to this, we kind of emerged more in the 20th century. What consumers do have an increased breadth of cultural taste and a willingness to cross sort of established hierarchical cultural boundaries. So you might, for example, go to the football in the afternoon which could be seen as more lowbrow, and then go to the opera at night, and that people can move from between these different cultural fields and have a far broader involvement with different taste cultures, which means that snobbery is very much being undermined at the present time. Emerson is at the University of Queensland, Michael Emerson, and he says that class here in Australia still matters, but in much more complex ways. He reckons that we do have considerable cultural mobility. So his theory is of cultural mobility, which needs to be distinguished from the omnivore thesis, in that the theory of cultural mobility proposes, A, that class still matters, that mobility does actually lead to privilege, that in order to be mobile you need to be part of the higher classes anyway, and it's not that high class individuals like lowbrow genres, it is that they use that knowledge of them strategically. So even if you don't like going to the football and you're say the vice chancellor of a university, you might use that strategically to have conversations with people, a broad range of people. Okay, so there's no doubt that Bourdieu and Giddens are the big names in the structure versus agency debate. But I also did want to introduce you to Margaret Archer. She is a UK academic, and I don't know very much about her background, other than that she has worked primarily at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom, and she got her PhD back in 1967 from the University of London. Margaret Archer argues that much social theory suffers from the problem of conflation, and conflation is where you put two things together which don't really belong together. So where her example is causal autonomy is denied to one side of the relationship. So this can take the form of autonomy being denied to agency, for example. So structure is favoured, and Bourdieu is usually criticised for that, or favoured for that. And so that's what she calls downward conflation. Alternatively, it can take the form of autonomy being denied to structure, with causal efficacy only granted to agency, and that's what she calls upwards conflation, and that would often be associated with Anthony Giddens' work. Her approach, Margaret Archer's approach, is that of analytical dualism. She recognises the interdependency between agency and structure, but says that they operate on different timescales. We inherit a particular social structure, which is the result of the intended and unintended consequences of people before us, and which can lead to the reproduction or transformation of the social structure. The society that millennials have inherited is very different in many ways, not all, but very different to the society that the boomers inherited, for example. And just one tiny, for instance, of that, of course, is the housing market. Very different from when boomers or the generation before that, where housing was very cheap and affordable. Because of their differing timescales, we can know, on the one hand, that structure and agency are interdependent, while on the other hand, we can analyse them as if they are a duality. And in that way, we can explore the factors and the interactions that reproduce or transform the initial structure. And it's that she's looking at in her 2003 book, Structure, Agency and the Internal Conversation. So this is about her fourth book, I think, where she's looking at structure and agency and how things happen. So she's really wanting to have a look at how agents influence the social structure and vice versa. So while conditioning accentuates, think habitus, the way that social context the individual operates is shaped, it neglects our capacity, she thinks, to establish a way of expressing our own concerns, our way of thinking about our own situation. And she reckons that we do this actually through an inner dialogue, an internal conversation. Individuals reflect on their social situation in the light of the current concerns and projects that they want to do. And on the basis of a series of research that she actually did, so she did interviews, and she did that with, I think, about 20 people in the United Kingdom from various demographics demographics, she came up with 3 distinctive forms of internal conversation. And she reckons this is the missing link between society and the individual structure and agency. This is how people work out whether they'll continue with how things are or whether they will do something differently. So I'll just introduce you to these 4 ideal types. Remember, ideal types comes from Max Weber. He's not saying that they're perfect and everything, person won't overlap in other types, but it's a topology, a way of thinking about different, in this case, reflexivities. So the first one that she comes up with is communicative reflexivity, or what she calls communicative reflexives. So these are, by and large, grow up in a context of belonging, social continuity. They might have been living in an area for quite some time. They have strong connections to the place and strong connections to people in the place, where important others remain present over time and then confirm their concerns and projects. If we look at one example of this, perhaps working class reflexives, for example, will have lived and developed their initial plans in the very stable context of others, such as family and friends who are important to them, and they confirm their personal identities grounded in particular careers and choices that will probably keep them within that particular working class orbit. They therefore accept the limits of their circumstances and are very happy with that. So other people are important to them, other people's opinions are important to them, and they'll accept what other people say about what it is they should be doing. That doesn't necessarily fit for everyone, and social class certainly does not simply determine a mode of reflexivity, according to Margaret Archer. Instead, she says there can be enormous discontinuities in a social context. And think, for example, about the massive changes in the working class in Australia with the massive downturn in manufacturing. So that's led to a lot of job losses. But that's not the only situation. It could be that you're in a situation where there has been continuity within a family in a place over time, but you feel socially rejected by your peers. So these disruptions or discontinuities within the social life can actually engender what she calls autonomous reflexivity. And this is a situation where people are less inclined to take so much notice of those families and friends and what they would like you to do. Their internal conversations actually generate decisions and plans that aren't confirmed by those significant others, but because they don't need that sort of confirmation. So they'll live in the social world, of course. They're not separate from other people, but their focus is typically, though not inevitably, but typically on work, and their stance towards society is strategic. They work out for themselves what they must do in order to achieve their goals. So the focus is on strategically orientating themselves to discovering ways through obstacles. And she reckons that comes often through this disruption, social disruptions that happen. People become autonomous, less interested in what other people have to say, and get very focused on the workplace, for example, and achieving goals. Her third group she calls meta-reflexives. Meta-reflexivity. Meta-reflexivity, she says, entails a self-consciousness of being self-conscious, an awareness that you are self-conscious. And she reckons that meta-reflexive, because they're so self-aware, probably very introspective types, become focused on self-knowledge. So early on they develop kind of a paramount concern with some sort of ideal self, one might say, I guess, and they'll inspect and converse with themselves on the question of how well they're achieving that ideal self. And where communicatives are evasive, she reckons, and the autonomous are strategic, meta-reflexives are subversive. Their concern is not attachment to those friends and families, and it's not to the performative skills associated with work, but they have some personal ideal or project, and the attainment of that project they're going to be the only ones who are going to make an assessment about that project, whether they've achieved it or fallen short in some way. And then the fourth type of reflexive she has is a fractured reflexivity. And these are where the internal conversations actually intensify distress. So rather than making a kind of a purposeful course of action, somebody with a fractured reflexivity actually is too distressed to be able to do that, and probably will need some guidance from outside of them anyway. So that's 4 types: communicative reflexivity, autonomous reflexivity, meta-reflexivity, and fractured reflexivity. These are kind of the key types, these ideal types of reflexivity that she says is kind of that mediating point, I guess, between the agent and between the social structure. And if you're interested in Margaret Archer's ideas, I have included some optional reading for this week. So, in summary, agency versus structure is not about binary oppositions. Social structures absolutely do constrain and shape, but people also have agency and in turn shape social structures. Giddens is more at the agency end of the continuum. Bourdieu is more at the structure end of the continuum. Archer, what she wants to do is she wants sociologists to separate structure and agency for analytical purposes while recognising their interdependence. Great, so thanks for listening, and